Hi everybody, welcome back. So this video I'm going to start diving into my Isaac build. If you're not familiar with Isaac, Isaac is a character on the Orville who I'm absolutely in love with. And yeah, so I've been starting working on the final jumpsuit, as you can see here, for Isaac. And I kind of wanted to go over the process of how I started with this, because it's actually been one of the more challenging garments I've had to construct and pattern out. But now I'm finally, as you can see, working on the final garment. So first off is, how did I even get to this point? I think in my previous video I showed my mock-up, which was about the 4th or 5th one I've done of the Isaac jumpsuit, trying to get the right fit. And so now I'm finally at the place where I feel comfortable working in my final fabrics. But first I wanted to show kind of one of the pieces that I patterned for, at least for this side of it. And as you can see, it's kind of interesting. It's got a bunch of other things attached on it and blended on. But what's interesting how I actually started out with this jumpsuit is I found like a regular jumpsuit pattern. Actually, I think it was like an old 1970s jumpsuit, and found one that was in my size, and I made it. And what you can actually see is, if you look very closely, you can see where there was a seam down the side. As you can see on this part, there's not going to be a seam down the side. I actually removed that. And that's what you can see here, that I've came in, and there's actually parts of this, because of how my hips were once I fit it to myself, where I actually have some pinned back to get to lay flat. I had to pin back certain parts of this. So when I did pin that back, I had to alter it to make up for where it wasn't laying flat, so that I still had the proper width that I needed, so it would actually fit me in the end. So once I got my mock-up fitting the way that I was happy with, I made some of the adjustments, and then we end up with this lovely piece here. It wasn't an easy thing to figure out. I consider myself pretty decent at sewing. I've just kind of figured things out along my way, and I think in my previous video I mentioned I do things weird, I do things that work for me, and that's what works best for me. I'm very, physical with the things that I do, so I might not necessarily do things by the book. I just kind of work with materials, I feel them, I see how they are actually going to work, how they manipulate, and just based on that I kind of come up with my solutions, specifically with when I'm patterning things. I'm trying to learn a little bit more. I actually have a book. I haven't gotten that far into it yet. I get impatient. Picked this up, Perfect Fitting. It's actually got some very helpful tips in it, and I found it interesting, but I kind of start to glaze over after a little bit. But still, sometimes it's nice to know the proper way to do things, but sometimes I just like to explore on my own. It's more fun, right? In this video, what I actually want to go through is not necessarily how I patterned that, but how I actually ended up with this part, because it was actually a little bit new techniques for me, because I hadn't worked with, this is actually a pleather, like vinyl-y like material, and I went to test a piece to sew it, and I realized, oh, I can't sew this. Let's see if I actually have a piece of, here it is. So this is the fabric I'm working with, and it's like a, I would say it's a pleather, and it's stretch, and it's, if you feel it, it's sticky. So when I went to go and sew it, I realized that the regular presser foot would not go, and I was like, what do I do? So of course I turned to Google and learned a bunch of different techniques that I'm going to share with you, and what I ended up finally settling on to get this done. It's a little tedious, but it also helped me get these really nice pretty lines for the quilting that I had to do. So yeah, let's hop right into it. Okay, so let's get sewing. So let's talk about your presser foots for your machine. So this was the presser foot that I always use for most of my sewing, just your regular standard foot. So let's take a look at what this did when I attempted to sew. So here's a little piece of this fabric, and I'm going to attempt to sew it. I don't think this is going to end well, but we'll find out. So let's go and see what happens. If you notice here, the fabric, it's just not moving. It's refusing to go. Just even if I try to push it through, maybe it really hates life. So obviously we have a problem here. You can also see, I don't know if you can see that, if you look really close, the stitches are all on top of each other, so it's not feeding appropriately. So when I realized that that wasn't an option, I started to do some research. How do I sew this type of fabric? What do I do? So a lot of people were like, well, there's a few different techniques. You can use tissue paper, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. You can also try different presser feet. So first I started with the presser foot options, and the two that I came across that people recommend is this one first is a roller foot. If you look, it's plastic, but it's got a little roller to help it feed better. And then another one here, which is actually ended up being my favorite, is just a non-stick foot. It's made and coated usually in Teflon, so it's able to go across the fabric. So if we kind of look at this, notice how, I mean, I'm pushing pretty hard. There's really not a lot of friction. The same with the roller foot. It wants to roll across the fabric. So let's take a look at how both of these work. Let's start with the roller foot first. And let's put that on my machine. There we go. Thread back. And here is roller foot test. Let's take a look how this works. You notice here, it's moving a lot better. I'm really not even doing it. It's actually feeding itself. So we're going pretty good here. All right. So roller foot seems to work. However, the thing that I noticed with the roller foot, specifically the one I have, might be hard to see. If I can get it in there. Oh, you can kind of see it in the reflection. It actually is marking the fabric. It's leaving a little residue of a little indentation or scratch in the fabric that I didn't really like. So I was like, maybe not the best option for me, right? Maybe it would be better if I worked with a tissue paper on top of it, but we'll get to that next. So then, finally, I tried the non-stick foot. So, non-stick foot, here we go. Let's pull this back. And here we go. Non-stick foot, and again, it's moving really nicely. I'm really not even having to do it. The machine is doing a decent job of feeding it itself. And it looks pretty happy to me. And let's take a look at this. I am using a little bit of a tighter stitch setting than what I did on Isaac. But yeah, as you can see, we have a decent stitch. It's nice. And it didn't leave any scratches, so that's great. So after that, I was like, okay, so I think the Teflon foot or the non-stick foot is going to be my best option. But now I need to draw all these really great lines. I could, use where I'm stitching versus some of the guides that I have of the foot as a guide to keep the line straight as I'm doing the quilting. But I just knew that I've done that before. It's really challenging and I wanted this to look really good. So what could I do? Should I mark the fabric? What can I mark it with? I would normally use a pencil on other fabrics, but it doesn't really work on this vinyl. So I don't know where my pencil is. I had a pencil that I could share that with, but otherwise I'm stuck with pen or something else that I don't know if it's going to leave a mark on the fabric or anything like that. So what I ended up doing was I ended up combining the nonstick foot with tissue paper. And as you can see on the tissue paper, I've drawn all of my wonderful, wonderful lines. So what you do is you come and you stick your tissue paper, and I'm not going to do this too delicately, but stick my tissue paper. Actually, this is a little too much. I'm going to tear this off, makes it a little easier. So we plop our tissue paper like so on our fabric. And we put this down. I'm actually going to up my stitch length a little bit since we're going for it's more of a top stitch anyway, right? And we're going to stitch along the lines like so. And I'm not trying too hard. Normally I would pay a little bit more attention to the lines I'm making, but it's this for a demo. And I'm just going to go all the way down here. I'm just going to do about 3 of these so you get an idea of what's going to happen here. Why this is so tedious, because this is just the beginning. Do another one more line. And yes, normally you would want to back stitch on your starts and stops, but I'm being lazy right now. For you sewing enthusiasts, there we go. So I have 2 of these, and my tissue paper here is definitely attached. So now what do? All you do is you go in, and you tear off the tissue paper. So you tear it off, and tear it off, and what do you know? We have the nice two prettily straight lines that were actually easy to stitch. I have no extra scratches or lines from my presser foot. It's wonderful. So very happy with this technique of using, and I might have been able to get away with using this foot in the tissue paper, but this just really helps limit any friction whatsoever. So I was really happy with that. So next, I'm going to show you how I prepped my my final pieces with the tissue paper to keep everything in place, to make sure it's all lined up. Again, another really tedious step, but hopefully it helps some of you out if anybody else is insane enough to attempt this costume. So it's a lot of little parts. So let's go and move on over to prepping that fabric. Okay, now we're gonna move on to prepping our fabric to get it ready to sew. So what I have here is this paper that I've already pre-drawn all the wonderful lines on so many lines. Did that a while. That took a little bit. So I have that. Great. Now all I need to do is grab my fabric. So for one of these panels, we actually have 3 different fabrics. We have the pleather silver material. We have some batting. This helps us give it that nice quilted look, that thickness that I'm looking for. And then I really don't want this fabric against me. It's a little scratchy if I'm actually wearing it. So I just have a piece of cotton broadcloth here just to back it. So this is the inside of the garment's a little nicer. All right, so now I need to get these all sorted and laid out appropriately. So we'll make sure we get these the right way. I also need to make sure I am doing this the right way. Let's see here, which side, this is the other side. So I need to figure out my right sides of my fabric here. There we go. So this goes this way. Okay. There we are. And if you want to be a perfectionist, you could also iron these. This was ironed before, but it's been laying around while I was doing the other side, but that's okay. Shouldn't affect anything too much. Now, one thing to note when you're doing this type of work, specifically when you're doing quilting, you can lose a little bit of the size of your fabric just because this adds volume, and when you're stitching it can cause some shrinkage to happen, whether it's this way or that way. This is not too thick of batting. I noticed too, and when I did that one, I tested it against my actual pattern, and I really didn't have that many problems with it. So if you're afraid of that, you can just cut a rectangle of all of these fabrics. You can go ahead and do all of the quilting and then cut your final piece out of that. I just didn't want to do all that much extra work. That was already a lot. The other panel that I did was 250 yards of thread. I really did not want to add any more to that work. So this was actually fine. Did what I needed it to do. All right, I'm not gonna go too perfect on this. All right, there we go. Now we're gonna put our vinyl on. And I'll prep the rest of this a little bit later, but I'll get you guys the ideas of this. So once I get this all nice and lined up, good enough, right? Good enough, okay. If you want, you can put a few pins on the edges. You need to be careful, specifically with like this vinyl material. Pins will leave lasting marks, so make sure if you are pinning to do it in your seam allowance, or get some type of clip. But even on this, I think clips might still cause problems. So you'd have to use tissue paper or something else to make sure that you're not leaving indentations that you don't want. So now that I would have this in this manner, what I would do is I would take this guy and then I'm going to lay it over. I would make sure that the lines on this are going to be straight, which was hard, so I'll probably pull down my other one to make sure my alignment is correct. And then once this is done, and I'm happy with this. This is perfect. This is exactly how I wanted to lay down. How do I keep this all together and transfer it over to my machine without everything shifting and moving? So again, in a few places I would put pins, but this is where this new fun thing that I found I have never really used before, which would be amazing. But this stuff is called Wonder Tape. It's wonderful because it's called Wonder Tape, right? But what this is, Wonder Tape is great for if you want to hold fabric together without pins. You're trying to do, you know, some seams. This stuff it's tape, but guess what? It's washable. So what happens when it's washable and water soluble. So when you go and let's say you're done with your fabric in your garment, you go to wash it with water, it dissolves, it goes away. In this case, I was just looking for something that didn't have a strong adhesive. So what I did is I cut off little tiny pieces of this stuff. And I put it in between, not where the lines are, because the lines are where I have stitching, and when I did a test, if I stitched over the Wonder Tape, it made it really hard to remove it because it's got a little, I mean, it's like plastic being stitched in place and didn't want to tear and remove, so it got to be a pain. So once I had this positioned, if you actually look in the larger, where these larger gaps are in here, I picked like every other one, so here and here, and I cut a little square of Wonder Tape and I put it on top of the fabric. And then once I had enough of them in position, then I went and I stuck down the tissue paper onto the Wonder Tape, and it stays perfectly in place. And then when I'm done, I can tear it off, and the Wonder Tape, just with a little bit of work, just kind of fingernail, kind of brush it away, it comes off and everything stays perfectly in place. So I'm not gonna keep you all while I prep this, but I'm gonna go ahead and prep this, and then once it's done, I'll show you what it looks like, and then we'll get to sewing this final piece. Anyway, see you in a little bit. Okay, so now I have all of this secured with a few pins and all of the Wonder Tape. Now I'm ready to sew, so I'm just gonna do a few of these. So when I start sewing this, I actually just pick somewhere in the middle, I feel, and then I work that way and then I'll work that way. That's just kind of preference for how everything kind of with the quilting and how everything lays. So do this. I'm using a 3.0 stitch length on this instead of a tighter stitch. And here we go. You can see how tedious this is. And I just follow the lines like I did on my sample piece. And you can see why this takes so long. I could sew a little faster, but I'm a perfectionist. I go a little slower on some of this. Not the best fast sewer. And one. There you go. I got one. I'm gonna try to clean up my threads a little bit as I go, but I'll clean them all up later when they get really bad. But I'm gonna go for two. stop here. But yeah, as you can see, we have 2 done. Yay! There's the back side. I won't bore you with the rest of this, but we already saw the final product at the beginning of this video, and I'll keep going on this. After this is done, I'll move into making piping that I'll need before I can start securing on the other pieces, which are going to be even more fun to make. Are going to involve some Sharpie and some puff paint to mimic what the Isaac fabric looks like on those. So until next time, I'll see y'all later. Bye!